Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 weapon tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering what's probably overall the best weapon category in Baldur's Gate 3, versatile weapons. Battleaxes, longswords, tridents, and warhammers. This weapon type can be wielded in one or two hands, and so goes on pretty much any build that is looking for a melee weapon, and also includes some of the strongest weapons for thrown weapon characters, some of the strongest support weapons in the game with varying cool effects that can power up a party dramatically. And so this is probably the single most important weapon category to draw weapons from, because of the wide variety of builds that they go on, and the sheer power level of these weapons. There are, of course, two types of versatile weapons that aren't in this list. Spears are in the polearms tier list, and quarterstaffs are in the staffs tier list, but this is every versatile martial weapon, and once we've done this, we will have covered every single weapon in Baldur's Gate 3 in these tier lists, which is pretty impressive to think about, if I do say so myself. Just as with my previous weapon and item tier lists, we'll be rating these weapons based on their power level at the point in the game at which you acquire them. Is it better than the equipment that you currently have? In other words, should you pick up this weapon, and should you use it? In S tier, I'm placing weapons that are best in slot for a wide variety of builds, or specific very powerful builds. In A tier, weapons that make interesting alternatives to the S tier weapons, enabling cool strategies, or giving you something special for certain kinds of encounters. In B tier, weapons that are situational. These are either used for off-meta builds or slightly weaker strategies, but still pretty interesting, or just a couple encounters in a given playthrough. In C tier, weapons that do have some uses. They can be used by various parties, but most parties won't want to use them, only specific very unusual comps or for certain very rare types of encounters. And in D tier, weapons that most parties can safely ignore because typically there are stronger options. I'm going to start by discussing the special weapon actions and base stats for each of these kinds of weapons. If you're not interested in learning about that, of course feel free to skip ahead to the Adamantine Longsword, which is the first of the magical weapons we'll be talking about. But as always, the weapon actions and base stats for these weapons are important information when you're evaluating one of these magical weapons, so I think it's pretty important to talk about. We'll start with the Battleaxe. Battleaxe does a d8 of damage if held one-handed, and a d10 of damage if held two-handed. As with all versatile weapons, you can wield it either one-handed or two-handed. It comes with three special weapon actions. The first of these is Cleave, allowing you to deal half damage to up to 3 enemies in a small area of effect. Cleave is a pretty useful weapon action, very useful in the early game, when you might have more damage than you need for given enemy HP totals. Some enemies have very low health, so half damage might still kill them reliably, or an enemy might have been brought low by an area of effect spell or something, and being able to split up your damage can prevent you from overkilling certain enemies and wasting damage as a result. Cleave also lets you spread special effects and on-hit effects from your weapons to multiple enemies, so it's a pretty useful weapon action to have once per short rest. Lacerate lets you make a normal weapon attack, dealing normal weapon damage, and enemies have to pass a con saving throw, or they become bleeding, taking 2 damage every turn, and having disadvantage on future constitution saves. That's not bad. Disadvantage on con saves is pretty useful, and a lot of these weapons do go on characters who trigger a lot of constitution saves on enemies, so making an enemy bleed can be very useful for the types of characters that use these versatile weapons most frequently. But overall, I would say this is on the weaker end for a weapon action. The 2 damage per turn is not a significant damage increase, and it doesn't come with like a crowd control effect or something that can really stop an enemy from hurting you in return. So Lacerate, I think, is one of the weaker special weapon actions in the game. The final weapon action that Battleaxes have is Maiming Strike, where you hit an enemy for reduced damage, a d4 of base damage, and they have to make a con save or become maimed for 2 turns, being unable to move. Inability to move, reducing enemies' movement speed to 0 in Baldur's Gate 3 is very, very strong for a couple reasons. Firstly, you can just trap an enemy in melee combat with your melee characters, which obviously is very powerful in and of itself. Secondly, in Baldur's Gate 3, when an enemy is knocked prone, they need to use half their movement to stand back up, and if they have 0 movement, they cannot stand back up. Because in BG3, enemies who are prone can't do anything. They're basically fully stunned while prone, unable to take reactions, unable to act at all. Maiming an enemy and then knocking them prone is the equivalent of stunning them. So having Maiming Strike on a weapon, with the relatively frequent access that parties get to the ability to knock enemies prone, gives you an at will, or once per short rest rather, an on-demand stun that you can use if you can set up that combination. If enemies fail the saving throw against this and then get knocked prone, they will lose at least 1 or possibly 2 full turns of actions and be unable to react to anything. This also bypasses a lot of stun immunities that later game bosses and stuff get, so this combination is incredibly powerful. Battleaxes are a pretty solid weapon overall, though non-magical battleaxes, by the time you get access to them, you're probably going to be upgrading to magical weapons anyways, so we're going to put these in D tier, but the base weapon itself is a pretty solid one. Longswords. Probably the most iconic weapon in any fantasy game. I think these are also the most common weapon type in Baldur's Gate 3. There's more enchanted longswords than any other kind of weapon, so definitely pays to know how they work. They do a d8 or a d10 of damage, depending on whether one-handed or two-handed, and come with 3 weapon actions. The first of these is Lacerate, just like the Battleaxe weapon action, making an enemy bleed. The second is Rush Attack, allowing you to use your action to move up to 30 feet, and hit an enemy. So basically you get to dash and attack in the same turn. And if you hit the enemy, then they become off balance, which gives you advantage on your next attack against them, or on attacks against them until they take damage, so basically until you hit another attack against them. This is a pretty powerful effect, mostly because it gives you extra mobility. Obviously, characters using longswords are melee characters, so they want to get in range of enemies. Being able to do that with your action rather than your movement is very powerful, and not having to spend a dash on it is very powerful. Just saves you action economy in fights where you're far away from enemies. Finally, you get Pummel Strike, which lets you use your bonus action to deal 1d4 of damage, so you get to make an attack as a bonus action. And if you hit the enemy with this one, they have to make a Constitution save or become dazed. Dazed enemies lose their reactions and get lower armor class, meaning that that's a pretty powerful effect. A lot of enemies in Baldur's Gate 3 have very powerful reactions, including on Honor Mode. A lot of the Honor Mode boss abilities are reactions, so dazing an enemy is always useful, but mostly being able to make an attack as a bonus action is really helpful to this kind of character. This bonus action attack can be used to trigger on-hit abilities, it can be used to trigger smites and things like that, so it can really power up your damage in a given round, using an action that characters that use this weapon type sometimes don't have amazing uses for, so it, again, helps you with your action economy. Longswords are great for action economy, therefore, because they can prevent you from having to dash and give you uses for your bonus action in turns where you don't have one that you want, so very useful weapon chassis as a result of that. Fighters start with longswords. Obviously, we're going to be trying to get away from our non-magical weapons as soon as possible, but they will be the best weapon type for a fighter that starts with one, so I'm going to give it C tier. The Trident. So, quick historical aside about tridents. This might seem like a goofy or made-up weapon, but these actually were real weapons intentionally designed for warfare. Of course, there's the improvised use of a trident, which is grabbing a pitchfork or fishing spear that you have to hand to use as a sharp, pointy stick. But also, a unit of infantry armed with tridents and bows can present a lot of sharp, pointy sticks towards enemies, and horses, especially horses that are pulling chariots, do not like to run into sharp, pointy sticks. So in very ancient warfare, in Egypt, in North Africa, and in Mesopotamia, you actually see examples of tridents, and it's fairly well documented that this was an intentional military strategy used deliberately, not just as improvised weapons. Kind of cool that these were, in fact, real. It definitely fell out of favor, but this was a successful military strategy for hundreds or thousands of years. In-game, tridents do a d6 of damage in one hand, or a d8 if held in both hands, so lower damage than the other martial versatile weapons, but they also come with the thrown weapon property to make up for that. In addition, they have 3 special weapon actions, so you can use them as a throwing weapon character, or for the 3 weapon actions they come with. The first of these is Rush Attack, just like the Longsword, letting you attack and move as a single action. The second is Piercing Strike, which causes enemies to make a con save, or they get the Gaping Wounds condition, taking 2 extra damage from every source for 2 turns. I think that's one of the better weapon actions out there, because this 2 extra damage adds up really quickly if you're hitting enemies consistently, and it will add to damage from things like magic missiles, or incidental damage that's being added on top of your attacks. Damage riders can often trigger it separately as well, so it will stack up to a ton of extra damage if an enemy has gaping wounds on them. Finally, their last one, and this is unique to Tridents, only Tridents get this, is Disarming Strike, forcing an enemy to make a strength saving throw. So you make a normal weapon attack, it hits for 1d4 damage instead of a d6, so very slightly lowered damage, but not by a lot. And then the enemy has to make a strength save or become disarmed. They just drop their weapon. Disarming an enemy is hugely powerful in Baldur's Gate. There's a lot of enemies that just can't fight. If they've been disarmed, you could pick up their weapon to use yourself. And so having access to this powerful ability, which normally you have to be a Battlemaster fighter and spend a superiority die on, or have another tool for, but Tridents just get this once per short rest. Having this powerful ability as a short rest weapon action is really, really nice, so Tridents as a base weapon chassis are generally speaking quite good. The non-magical Trident, even though you don't get it until a little bit later on, therefore does have some uses. You can pick it up. I think there might be one on the starting beach. I can't remember if that was random loot, or if there's a guaranteed one, but either way, you can find one fairly early in the game, and the disarm weapon action is very useful in early game fights, so C tier for the Trident. Obviously you're going to switch to magical weapons as soon as you can, but the disarm weapon action is super powerful. The Warhammer also does a d8 or a d10 of damage, and comes with 3 special weapon actions. The first of these is Concussive Smash, which lets you, as a normal weapon attack, force an enemy to make a con save or become dazed. So just like Pummel Strike, it dazes enemies, preventing their reactions. Unlike Pummel Strike, though, it doesn't give you a bonus action attack that you can use. So it's not quite as powerful as Pummel Strike, I think, but still a very useful option. The second is Weakening Strike, which lets you force an enemy to make a con save, or just as a normal weapon attack again. A strength save, just as a normal weapon attack again. And if they fail the strength save, then they get disadvantage on all of their attack rolls for 2 turns. Giving an enemy 2 turns of disadvantage on their attack rolls is, of course, really, really powerful, so Weakening Strike is a very good ability for use in longer combats, and because it's a strength save, it can be used against enemies that attack using their dexterity, so archers or rogue-type enemies who attack with their dexterity, and they will probably have very low strength saving throws, and so you can really put the hurt on those enemies. Finally, the last one is Backbreaker, also a strength saving throw, normal weapon attack, and if the enemy fails the strength save, they become prone for 2 turns. Knocking enemies prone is, of course, ludicrously powerful. A prone enemy can't do anything, instantly loses concentration on any spell they're concentrating on with no saving throw, and like I talked about in the Battleaxe section, if you prevent them from moving in some way, they can't get back up. This is 2 turns of prone, meaning that it works with frightened or maimed to prevent enemies from getting back up, and so they will be unable to act at all if you combine it with ways to reduce their movement to 0. Warhammers are also the starting weapon for Paladin, and are one of the best starting weapons for any class, so if you start as a Paladin, it's going to be really awesome to have a Warhammer from the start of the game. Just because these are non-magical weapons, and again, we're going to want to swap to magical weapons as quickly as we can, I'm going to give it C tier, but this is probably the most powerful chassis of these 4 weapons, thanks to the excellent collection of weapon actions and the high base damage of Warhammers. The +1 versions of these weapons are, of course, identical, but with +1 to attack and damage, and for the most part, these +1 generic weapons in this category don't have a lot of use. If you have a character that wants to wield them in one hand, you're better off with a Morning Star, because those just have the best collection of weapon actions in the game and do the same damage, and a character that wants to wield their weapon in 2 hands is going to want a great weapon to be able to do more damage. The exception to this is the Trident, which is a truly excellent weapon, the +1 Trident, because it's a thrown weapon. You should pretty much always collect any weapons with the thrown weapon property, because they're very useful for starting combats, even if you have a returning weapon. There's a bug where if you start a combat, your weapon won't return, so you want to collect weapons with the thrown weapon property. They also give your melee characters good ranged weapon options just by having them in your inventory. In addition, the +1 Trident comes with the disarming strike action, so a character that's a thrower can use it just by default to do thrown weapon damage, but also now has a situational and super powerful ability to disarm enemies. So the +1 Trident's going in A tier, and the other 3 are going into D tier because they're outclassed by other weapons, whether one-handed or two-handed in general. And the first of the magical weapons that we're talking about, the Adamantine Longsword. I should mention also, I'm doing these weapons alphabetically within the act. Since I don't know what order you're going to play the act in, that's the way that makes the most sense to present these weapons, rather than trying to guess what order you're going to find every weapon in. The Adamantine Longsword is a +1 longsword with 2 magical effects. The first is that if you hit an object, so not a creature like a door or a chest or something, it's always a critical. And the second is that it ignores resistance to slashing damage. The criticals against objects, basically not useful, but ignoring resistance to slashing damage, definitely useful for a slashing damage weapon. Of course, the Adamantine Longsword, as one of the Adamantine Forge items, comes with a tremendous opportunity cost. You have to give up, if you forge this item, you spend, essentially, either an Adamantine Shield or an Adamantine Armor, and those are some of the absolute best Act 1 items in the game. Is this weapon worth it? Definitely not. Giving up on the Adamantine Shield or Armor is a tremendous cost, so only parties that don't have any shield users or any medium or heavy armor users would be interested in this weapon at all. There is one use to this weapon's effect, though, which is that the ignoring slashing damage applies not only to attacks with this weapon, but to any source of slashing damage that character would do, which includes if you're dual wielding, slashing damage in a weapon held in your other hand, or slashing damage from ranged attacks if you have a way to do that, or slashing damage from spells, most notably Cloud of Daggers, which does slashing damage, and pretty much ignores every other way of resisting its effects. So making Cloud of Daggers ignore resistance is a moderately useful effect in some very, very specific encounters. Even with that very specific use, though, the Adamantine Longsword is still useless, because the Adamantine Sickle does the same thing, or Scimitar does the same thing, and is a light weapon, so can be used alongside another weapon that provides a passive benefit. So even if you're trying to make enemies, to pierce enemies' slashing resistance, there's a better version of the Adamantine weapon available, so you would never want to make the Adamantine Longsword. D tier. The Ceremonial, Battleaxe, Longsword, and Warhammer are story items. They are used in a specific story puzzle late in Act 1. Outside of their use for story events, they are just generic +1 weapons. They have no special weapon properties, and by this time, of course, you have more powerful weapons than generic +1 weapons. I put their counterparts in D tier, and these you get much later, so obviously D tier for these. Next up, Faithbreaker. Faithbreaker is a +1 Warhammer that comes with an additional short rest weapon action. That makes 4 total short rest weapon actions, by the way, which means that depending on how frequently you rest, you can probably use a relevant special weapon action basically every turn of every combat, because you have so many available when you're using this weapon. The weapon action it comes with allows you to, once per short rest, add your strength modifier to your damage again, so double your strength to damage, plus an extra d6 of force damage, and then enemies have to pass a strength saving throw or be knocked backwards 17 feet. Pushing an enemy with a weapon attack is a pretty powerful ability, because you can do damage to them, and then also potentially knock them off of cliffs or into hazards. Unlike the shove attack, this does damage, while also repositioning the enemy, so that's pretty useful as well. Meaning that if you don't have a handy cliff to handy abyss to instant kill the enemy, you can still deal damage, knock them off a cliff and they take falling damage, knock them into a spike growth or something that an ally has set up. Being able to reposition enemies on the battlefield is very powerful and, in my opinion, quite underrated as an effect in Baldur's Gate. So this short rest weapon action is very useful. and it being short rest is not a tremendous penalty because that's about how often you would find this weapon action relevant. Given how many options this weapon gives you in combat, I actually like it quite a bit because every turn you have your choice of 4 different weapon actions to choose from, all of which are a little bit situational but reasonably powerful, and so Faithbreaker actually makes for a pretty good weapon. The real question is it better than a +1 Morningstar or a two-handed weapon for a two-handed weapon character? I think most two-handed weapon characters are going to prefer a great weapon, like the Sword of Justice or something along those lines. But for characters that want a one-handed weapon, the Faithbreaker is probably the best that you're going to get in the early game in terms of its actual weapon action effects. I'm going to give it A tier because it's just a really solid weapon for a one-handed character with a shield. Obviously, there's going to be some that will outpace it, and we'll talk about those in a second. But the Faithbreaker is just a really nice weapon. Just feels good to play because you always have good options. The Githyanki Longsword. There's actually 2 versions of this weapon. I've just combined them into one because this can appear as non-magical versions, which are identical to a normal longsword, or as +1 versions, which are identical to a +1 longsword. Either way, they show up after you already have access to the normal versions of these weapons, so you never need these. D tier. The Intransigent Warhammer. So, confession time, somehow I had never picked up this weapon until I started this tier list and decided to test it. And when I did, I was like, wow, I've really been missing out. The Intransigent Warhammer is a magical Warhammer, but with no enhancement bonus. It's a +0 weapon. But whenever you get a critical hit or kill an enemy, it will knock everything around you prone. Every enemy around you prone. This effect doesn't hit allies, it only hits hostile creatures around you, and it has a 10-foot radius, so a pretty large radius to force enemies to make a saving throw or become prone. The saving throw is based on your spell save DC, although it seems to be bugged. The combat log doesn't show the name of the character and also calculates the DC wrong, so I think this weapon does still have some bugs. There also were some pretty funny bugs with this weapon in early access, apparently, where it would trigger the effect even on a critical miss, and also would trigger it on ranged spell attacks, so you could use this to knock enemies prone with, like, Eldritch Blasts and stuff. Those I've tested and have both been fixed, but the Intransigent Warhammer still does have a couple bugs with it. Knocking enemies prone, obviously, is really, really good, and being able to do so passively on conditions that are pretty easy to trigger, making a critical hit or killing an enemy, are obviously excellent. The fact that it's an area of effect and uses your spell save DC is pretty nice as well, because it's going to fairly reliably knock enemies over, especially for the kinds of characters that are most interested in this effect. Another thing that's relevant about this is it is a 2-turn duration prone, so enemies, if you reduce their movement speed to 0, won't be able to get back up. Well, there is, in fact, a type of character that loves to get critical hits and reduces enemies' movement speed to 0 when it does, and that is the Great Old One Warlock. If you use this as your weapon for a Pact of the Blade Great Old One Warlock, who's already spec'd into getting critical hits, you're going to be knocking enemies prone and frightening them, which, as a combination on the attack with this weapon, instantly stuns the enemy with a single attack. If you kill an enemy also, then you trigger the effect of knocking enemies over, so the Great Old One Warlock using this weapon is going to be able to very, very reliably prevent enemies from doing anything very, very easily. The saving throws against this effect will use your spell save DC, which as a Warlock is going to be pretty high, so the Intransigent Warhammer makes an awesome weapon for a Pact of the Blade Great Old One Warlock to very easily be able to prone enemies and lock them down on the ground. You can also use this with a Tiger Barbarian, who can cause enemies to bleed with their rage attacks, and maim enemies that they bleed with the level 6 Barbarian feature, and so you can knock enemies prone and maim them, preventing them from getting back up. The Intransigent Warhammer works very well in that strategy, as well as an alternative to the normal reverberation stacks that you build with Tiger Barbarians. Even though this weapon isn't a +1 weapon, all of these effects passively just being able to be passed out by your character make it a pretty awesome weapon, and I think it goes in a bunch of pretty cool builds. I'm going to give it A tier because obviously you're giving up some hit chance, although I will say for the critical hit focus build that doesn't matter as much because critical hits always hit, so you don't need as much of a hit bonus with crit builds. But the Intransigent Warhammer gives you a lot of cool options for a lot of cool builds, and by default, just knocking enemies prone when you crit them isn't a bad weapon in and of itself, so A tier for the Warhammer. Next up, Larethian's Wrath. This is a +1 longsword, but notably, despite being a longsword, this is a finesse weapon, meaning it can be used either with your strength, as a normal longsword, or with your dexterity modifier. So, rogues or dexterity-based characters can use Larethian's Wrath and benefit from all of the benefits of having high dexterity, which are, of course, many, because that's the best stat in the game. In addition to being a +1 finesse longsword, it also gives you a special weapon action once per short rest, which lets you make an AoE attack in a cone, and it's a pretty large cone, it's a 13-foot cone, where every enemy in that cone takes normal weapon damage, and even if you miss, they take half weapon damage. Being able to do guaranteed damage even on a miss is pretty incredible, and the fact that it's an AoE is really nice, so it lets you finish off low health enemies very, very easily. This weapon, also being a finesse weapon, enables a ton of builds to use it that wouldn't otherwise be able to use it, so it's going to go on a lot of characters. Even though when you're not using the special action, this is just a normal +1 longsword, that makes it one of the best one-handed weapons in Act 1, in my opinion. The special weapon action is awesome and gives you a ton of utility for a lot of different fights. And the fact that it's a finesse weapon means that it goes on a lot of builds that otherwise wouldn't be able to use a martial weapon at all. So Larethian's Wrath is an excellent weapon that I'm going to give S tier. Next up, what is probably the most discussed weapon in all of Baldur's Gate 3, Phalar Aluve. Phalar Aluve is a +1 longsword, and just like Larethian's Wrath, it's also a finesse weapon, so characters that want to have high dexterity can use it. You don't need high strength in order to use this weapon. It also gives you a +1 bonus to your performance skill, which isn't super important, but is a nice little bonus for flavor, but mostly this comes with another short rest weapon action. You can have this, you can activate this weapon and either put it into Sing mode or Shriek mode, which provide different benefits. If you put it in Sing mode, it gives everybody in a 20-foot radius of you, every ally in a 20-foot radius of you, a +1d4 to their attack rolls and their saving throws. So basically the effect of Bless, but it stacks with normal Bless, which is already a super powerful ability. +1d4 to all your attacks on top of normal Bless is excellent, and being able to do that for 5 turns once per short rest is amazing. But Sing mode isn't actually the good mode on Phalar Aluve, because Shriek mode is unbelievably broken, and is one of the absolutely most powerful abilities in the game. While you have Phalar Aluve set to Shriek, every enemy within 20 feet of you takes a d4 of thunder damage from additional thunder damage whenever they take damage from any source. This is similar to Gaping Wounds, the weapon action, where it triggers off of everything, but even more so. Even on Honor mode, Phalar Aluve is probably going to trigger 3 or 4 times per attack on just like any normal attack, because it triggers off of weapon damage and damage riders and other random damage that you might have. And if you have attacks that hit multiple times in a turn, like for example a magic missile, then you're going to be dealing d4s of thunder damage per missile, or per scorching ray beam, or per tick of Spirit Guardians. There's an absurd number of ways to abuse Phalar Aluve to incredible effect. I just stopped being able to talk there. To incredible effect, to create massive amounts of damage with this weapon. But even if you're not trying to break it, it's probably going to yield plus 40 damage per turn of combat, even if you don't optimize around this weapon at all. This is one of the absolute most powerful weapons in the game for Honor mode, on top of just being a great weapon in and of itself. A +1 longsword that's a finesse weapon is just a solid weapon already. Characters that want it as a weapon will be very happy with it as a weapon, but also you don't need proficiency with it to activate Sing or Shriek, so you can benefit with this benefit from it on any party, regardless of whether you have longsword proficiency or anything. And so you will be able to use Phalar Aluve to maximum effect in any party, and the amount of damage that you get from it is ridiculous. Even if you decide that you don't like the bugged bonus damage from Shriek, and in my own play, I never activate Shriek because I find it a little too cheesy. Activating Sing is ludicrously powerful already, so even if you completely ignore the most powerful thing that this weapon does, it's still probably like one of the absolute best weapons in the game. S tier, of course, for Phalar. Next up, the Sparky Points. The Sparky Points is a trident with no enhancement bonus that whenever you hit an enemy with it, you get 2 lightning charges. This is a quest reward, so you have to choose between the Sparky Points and the Jolt Shooter or the Spell Sparkler. So obviously it comes with some opportunity cost, but generating lightning charges on a hit is pretty nice. Lightning charges give you a +1 to attack and damage while you have any of them, and then if you get 5 of them, they deal an extra d8 of lightning damage. So basically this is a +1 weapon after your first hit with it, and then it does a little bit of extra damage every turn, every couple attacks, which is a pretty powerful effect. Obviously also stacks well with other things that generate lightning charges. The Sparky Points wouldn't be a terrible weapon, except that it has this high opportunity cost, which is that it costs you the Spell Sparkler or the Jolt Shooter. Now, the Jolt Shooter is mostly outclassed by the Titan String Bow, which is available at the same location, so you won't usually want the Jolt Shooter, but the Spell Sparkler is a really powerful weapon that is very useful in a lot of parties, so losing out on that is definitely a real downside. That being said, there are other staffs that are pretty good, so you could still use the Sparky Points, but given that this is basically you're getting a +1 weapon, a +1 Trident, I guess a slightly improved +1 Trident, but it's costing you a fairly powerful staff, I'm going to give the Sparky Points C tier, because while I think it is like a little better than a +1 Trident, it's not that much better than other weapons that are available at this point in the game. And also it costs you a really powerful weapon in order to get it. Voss's Silver Sword. Voss's Silver Sword is available either in Act 1 or in Act 3, depending on exactly what story choices you take during Act 1. Unlike the Silver Sword of the Astral Plane, this is an intended mechanic. You're supposed to be able to get Voss's Silver Sword in Act 1, but it does change the story pretty drastically if you do, so I decided to just rate this one both when you get it in Act 1 and when you get it in Act 3, because it's a fairly uncommon story choice, I think, to grab it in Act 1, so I wanted to rate it based on the first time it's available and on what I think is probably the most typical playthrough. In Act 1, either way, it has the same stats, but we're going to rate it now as for when you grab it in Act 1. Voss's Silver Sword is a +2 longsword that deals an extra d4 of psychic damage on every attack. Obviously, that's a pretty powerful weapon already, but then it also has a bunch of other magical abilities. In addition to that, it gives you an extra d4 to attack rolls and damage against Githyanki, Aberrations, Fiends, and Elementals, and that's like half of the enemies in Baldur's Gate are Githyanki, Aberrations, Fiends, or Elementals, including several of the absolutely most difficult fights in the game. So that's a pretty powerful bonus against some of the most dangerous enemies in the game. This effect also works on, this is a passive and will work on other attacks that you make. So if you have this weapon equipped and are an archer, you'll get this bonus 1d4 to attack rolls and damage on your bow shots as well, while you have Voss's Silver Sword equipped, which makes it a pretty powerful weapon for whether or not you're using it as a weapon. In addition to that, once per long rest, you can cast the Paladin spell, the Paladin Smell, Wrathful Smite for an extra d6 of psychic damage, and potentially frightening enemies. Wrathful Smite once per long rest, not a particularly powerful addition, but the fact that this is a +2 longsword that does a d4 of psychic damage and has an incredibly powerful passive for basically throughout the game, it's just very relevant throughout the entire game, against a lot of the most difficult fights in the game, makes this obviously an S tier weapon. If you get it in Act 1, you're going to be using it pretty regularly throughout Act 1 and 2, and probably on into at least parts of Act 3. And finally, the last of the Act 1 weapons, the Witchbreaker. I wanted to make a joke about the name of this weapon, but I couldn't figure out a way to do it in a family-friendly way, so you'll just have to imagine it. The Witchbreaker is a +1 battle axe with 2 additional magical abilities. First of these is that you get advantage on attack rolls against concentrating enemies. So if an enemy is concentrating on a spell, you have advantage on attack rolls against them. Like a lot of weapon passives, this works whether or not you're attacking with this actual weapon. So it's going to work on attack rolls that you make with spells, attack rolls that you make with arrows, and stuff like that. So the Witchbreaker, pretty powerful if an enemy is concentrating on a spell. That being said, for an enemy to be concentrating on a spell, they have to have cast a spell, which you typically want to avoid letting enemies do. So while this will come up definitely throughout your playthrough, it will not come up as often as you might think if you're playing reasonably well. In addition to that, you get a short rest weapon action that lets you do normal weapon damage plus your proficiency bonus again, or plus your proficiency bonus, so a little bit of extra weapon damage, and then silence an enemy for 2 turns. Silenced enemy obviously can't cast spells, and so you will be able to prevent them from casting any future spells, and of course if you hit them while they're concentrating, they're going to lose concentration on their spell. You will have an easier time hitting them, and then you'll silence them, preventing them from casting additional spells in future. This is a pretty decent weapon against spellcasting enemies. The advantage on against concentrating enemies and the situational silence are both pretty nice. The real question is, how does this compete with the Susser weapons, which just silence passively when enemies hit, rather than needing a short rest weapon action? And the answer is, it's honestly not a huge difference, because you don't really need to silence enemies more than once per short rest, and the advantage on attack rolls is pretty relevant. That being said, as just a +1 battle axe, this is going to be a situational weapon. It's only useful against concentrating enemies, so I'm going to give it B tier, because it will be useful in some encounters, but overall, I think that you're going to be better off with a more generically powerful weapon most of the time. So, at the end of Act 1, you're going to have Voss's Silver Sword equipped, if you picked it up, because of how powerful it is compared to other Act 1 weapons, and Phalar Aluve active somewhere in your party because of the overwhelming power that it provides to every single honor mode party. In addition to that, characters that want a finesse weapon and want to actually make attacks with their weapons, as opposed to standing in the forefront and carrying Phalar for their allies, will strongly consider using Larethian's Wrath. It's a very powerful weapon that gives you AoE damage. A Pact of the Blade Great Old One Warlock can get a ton of benefit from the Intransigent Warhammer, as can any other build that's centered around knocking enemies prone, because of the passive effect knocking enemies prone being so great. And the Faithbreaker will be an interesting alternative, but for the most part has been superseded by these other weapons at this point. The Faithbreaker was a powerful weapon for part of Act 1, but mostly by this point you're going to be using the S-tier weapons, or the Intransigent Warhammer if you want the Faithbreaker's effect. I'm also actually going to make one change here, now that I sort of look at this tier list in its whole setup, and I'm going to bump the +1 Warhammer up to C tier. It's the best of these 3 versatile weapons, and while it is true that two-handed weapons will typically supersede it for two-handed weapon characters, and a +1 Morning Star is mostly just a better version of the +1 Warhammer, you can't guarantee finding those at early merchants, and so the +1 Warhammer is a totally reasonable alternative to those weapons. Obviously, you're going to want to swap it out for Phalar or other more powerful weapons, but it's a reasonable purchase from an early merchant, so I think it does deserve C tier. Alright, my friends, unfortunately that is all the time that I have to record today, because it's been a pretty busy week, and I'm still recovering from being sick, so I'm trying not to talk too long and strain my voice. So we're going to do this one in 2 parts. There's obviously a lot of versatile weapons, and they're incredibly powerful as a weapon category, so I want to make sure that we give each of them their due consideration. As always, of course, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to hit like and leave a comment, and if you think that there's something else that I missed, something about one of these weapons that I missed, or one of them deserves to be in a different tier than I have placed it, then please do let me know. I'm always interested in seeing people's experience with these various weapons, and am very open to moving things around if you have a good argument or good reason as to why it should be moved. As always, of course, you can subscribe to my channel for part 2 of this video and other Baldur's Gate 3 tier lists and strategy game analysis. Now that we will be finishing the weapon tier lists, I will be doing a grand wrap-up, just like I did for the items, where I go over the best weapons in each act, which should give you a really good reference for what weapons you should pick up in each act and which are the most important for various builds. So look forward to that. Thank you for watching, my friends, and I will catch you next time.